More settlers died from fever than from gunfire. When the milk sickness came, it didn't just kill you, it erased entire families from the land. But what if the very people settlers feared most held the secret not just to survival, but to rebuilding a life from the ashes? This is the story of the Apache, a people who understood the rhythms of the land in ways settlers couldn't fathom. They weren't just warriors, they were master ecologists, healers, and mentors. At a time when survival balanced on a knife's edge, their ancient wisdom became the only lifeline for those who had lost everything. So how did a lone cowboy, his world reduced to ashes, discover that his last hope lay with the very tribe he was raised to fear? His name was Eli McCullough. By 1874, he had carved out a hardscrabble ranch in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains, a land the Apache called home for centuries. Eli wasn't a conqueror. He was a survivor, fleeing the memory of a Tennessee farmstead lost to the same milk sickness that would later haunt his dreams. He believed in two things: the strength of his own two hands and the absolute silence of the wilderness that now surrounded him. He built his cabin alone, breaking the stubborn soil, believing isolation was the only reliable defense against loss. The Apache watched him. To Eli, they were shadows in the rocks, a threat whispered about in the sparse settlements. He didn't know their bands were led not by hereditary kings, but by men who earned their status through generosity and wisdom. He didn't know that for generations before the Spanish came, these same people had traded peacefully at great fairs, exchanging buffalo robes for Pueblo pottery. He saw only the warrior because that was the story he'd been given. Then came the deluge. A freak storm in the high mountains sent a wall of water screaming down the arroyos. Eli, checking his northern line, saw the danger not to his own land but to the cluster of wickiups nestled in the valley below, an Apache seasonal camp. He saw the children playing by the rising creek. He didn't see enemies. He saw people. The same instinct that made him rope a calf sent him galloping down the slope, shouting, waving his arms, herding families toward the higher red rock benches. He worked alongside the men of the village, not as a savior, but as another pair of desperate hands, wresting belongings from the churning mud. When the waters receded, a profound silence fell. The village was damaged, but everyone was alive. The Apache leader, a man named Goyathle, whose name meant one who yawns, but whose eyes missed nothing, approached Eli. He didn't offer thanks in words. He studied the cowboy's mud-caked face, his worn hands. He saw the deep solitude in him, recognized it as a different kind of sickness. In that moment, a bridge was built not on gratitude, but on a shared understanding of survival. Days later, as Eli prepared to return to his solitude, Goyathle approached him one final time. He placed a small, weathered leather pouch in Eli's hand. The leather was soft, stamped with symbols Eli couldn't read. "You carry an empty place inside," Goyathle said, his Spanish slow and deliberate. "You fill it with work, with quiet. This is not enough. When the empty place becomes the whole world, when you see only ashes, then you open this." Eli, bewildered, protested. He had helped, that was all. He needed no payment. Goyathle closed Eli's fingers around the pouch. "This is not payment, this is a map, but it does not show land, it shows a path for the heart. You will know the time." With that, the Apache turned and walked back to his people, leaving Eli holding the mysterious object, a tangible piece of a world he did not understand. For years, the pouch lived on a shelf in Eli's cabin, a curiosity, a reminder of a strange day. He built his life. He fell in love with a resilient woman named Clara, a widow who understood loss. Together, they dreamed the ranch into something more. 2 children filled the cabin with laughter, a boy, Jack, and a girl, Sarah. The empty place Goyathle spoke of seemed to heal, filled with the thunder of little feet and the warmth of shared silence by the fire. The pouch was forgotten. The Apache, he heard, had been moved to a reservation far to the south. The old ways, it seemed, were ending. But the land holds its memories. The milk sickness, that white snake root poison, had come west with the cattle. It worked silently, invisibly. One cow, then another, grew listless. Then Clara complained of a bitter taste in her mouth. The trembling started. Within a week she was gone. Eli buried his wife on the hill overlooking the ranch, his heart a stone in his chest. He had no time to grieve. He had Jack and Sarah to protect. He worked himself to exhaustion, a frantic barrier against the despair he now felt lapping at the edges of his world. He failed. The sickness lingering in the land took his bright-eyed Sarah next. Then Jack, his strong boy, faded before his eyes. In a cruel span of 4 months, Eli McCullough went from a man with a family to a ghost haunting his own land. The cabin was deafeningly silent. The empty place wasn't just inside him anymore. It was the air he breathed, the dust on the floor, the view from every window. He was a man hollowed out, living in a monument to his own loss. And then the bandits came. Not Comanche warriors, but desperate men of his own kind, smelling weakness. They came for the cattle, the tools, the last remnants of his dream. Eli fought with the fury of a man with nothing left to lose, but he was 1 against 5. They pistol-whipped him, took what they wanted, and for sport, set fire to the barn. The wind carried the embers to the cabin roof. Eli could only watch, slumped against the well, as the last physical proof of his life's work. The hand-hewn logs, Clara's quilt by the window, Jack's whittled toys, vanished into a roaring orange inferno. As dawn broke, painting the sky in sickly hues over the smoking ruins, Eli sat on a charred beam. All was ashes. The empty place was the whole world. His trembling, soot-blackened hand went to his chest, where beneath his shirt he had taken to wearing the leather pouch on a thong. A final, desperate superstition. He had lost faith in everything, except the memory of a promise in a dying man's eyes. With fingers that barely obeyed, he broke the brittle sinew stitch sealing the pouch. He upended it into his palm. Out fell not 1 item but 2. A single perfect eagle feather and a tightly rolled scroll of birch bark. He unrolled it. On it was a map drawn in charcoal and ochre, not of mountains and rivers but of symbols, a turtle, a winding path, a circle of lodges, and beneath it in careful phonetic Spanish a message. It said, "The heart that saves a village is never alone. Your village waits. Follow the feather, it will show you the way home." Eli stared, uncomprehending. Home was gone. Home was ashes. But as he held the feather up, a morning breeze caught it, twisting it in his hand, pointing insistently not east towards the dead settlements, but west into the deepest, most forbidden Apache heartland. What he did next would defy every law of his world and lead him to a truth hidden in plain sight for centuries. To follow the feather was insanity. The Dragoon Mountains were a fortress of sheer cliffs and narrow passes, a place where cavalry patrols vanished and legends of lost gold were warnings, not invitations. For a white man alone, it was a death sentence. But Eli McCullough was already dead. The man who saddled his one surviving horse was a ghost, moving on an instinct deeper than reason. The feather, tied now to his saddle horn, was his only compass. The first day was a lesson in humility. The map was not a cartographer's tool. The turtle symbol led him not to a pond, but to a specific, massive sandstone formation that, from a certain angle, looked exactly like a resting turtle. Here, the feather, caught in a cross breeze, spun and pointed to a crack in the rock wall almost invisible until you stood directly before it. It was a trail, but not for horses. Eli had to abandon his mount, his last tie to his old life, tethering it with hope he might return. He entered the crack with just a canteen and the pouch. Inside was another world, a hidden canyon lush with cottonwoods and a trickling spring. This was the first revelation. The Apache weren't just hiding from the army, they were preserving ecological arcs, secret gardens known only through oral tradition. For 3 days he traversed this way, the symbolic map coming alive. The winding path was a real canyon that snaked through the mountains. He found caches of food, dried venison, pemmican, sealed in pouches and left in stone niches. He was expected. Or someone was. The silence was watchful. On the 4th day, he heard the click, the sound of a rifle hammer being cocked. He froze, hands raised slowly. 2 Apache men materialized from the scrub oak. They were young, their faces hard, dressed in a mix of traditional clothing and cavalry-issue trousers. They did not speak. One gestured with his rifle barrel for Eli to move. They disarmed him of his hunting knife, his empty pistol, But when one reached for the leather pouch around his neck, Eli instinctively clutched it. The guard paused, looked at the symbols, then met Eli's eyes. Something shifted. The contempt didn't leave, but it was joined by a flicker of confusion. They didn't take it. They brought him not to a prison, but to the edge of a high mesa. Below, hidden in a bowl of land invisible from any Army scout's vantage point, was the circle of lodges from the map. But it wasn't a village from the past. It was a hybrid, a resilient adaptation. Wickiup stood beside log cabins. Horses grazed in a penned valley. Children, some in buckskin, some in calico, played together. This was the second, staggering revelation. Goyethlay's band had never fully surrendered. A core group had slipped away, using their profound knowledge of the land to create this haven. They weren't waiting to die out. They were waiting for the storm to pass. Eli was brought before the council fire. The faces that stared back were not the faces of the desperate villagers he'd saved from the flood. These were the faces of deliberate survival, etched with patience and quiet power. And then an elder stood. It was not Goyethlay, but a woman. Her hair was white, her eyes held the same knowing depth. She spoke in clear English. "You carry my brother's promise. I am Datest. Goyethlay walked on 3 winters past. He spoke of you, of the man with the empty eyes who helped carry children from the water. He said you would come when your world turned to ash. He said we must show you how to see the green shoots in the ashes." Eli was speechless. The plan, the foresight, was breathtaking. The pouch wasn't a mystical charm. It was a meticulously crafted invitation, a key to a sanctuary built on a tradition of mentorship Goyethlay knew his own people needed to preserve. In that moment, Eli's entire understanding flipped. He wasn't being rescued by savages. He was being assessed by a sophisticated culture practicing a profound form of spiritual triage. They were offering him a place in a living system, but first, he had to prove he could learn. He was given a corner of a cabin, not as a guest but as a participant. His first task was not to fight or hunt, but to listen. Datest assigned a boy, no more than 10, named Kos, to be his guide. "He will teach you the names of things," she said. "The true names." Kos, serious beyond his years, showed Eli which plants stopped bleeding, which bark made tea for fever, which berries were safe only after the first frost. Eli, a rancher who thought he knew the land, realized he had only ever scraped its surface. He was learning botany, ecology, and pharmacy from a child. This was the Apache knowledge system, practical, immediate, pass-through doing. The work healed his hands but agitated his soul. He was surrounded by family, grandparents, parents, children, a web of connection that highlighted the yawning void within him. He'd wake at night, the memories of Clara and the children a physical pain. One morning he found Datest waiting for him. She held 2 cups of bitter tea. "You drink the grief," she said. "You do not bury it. It becomes part of you like the scar from a wound. It tells you where you have been. It makes you careful, but it must not make you brittle." She spoke of their own losses, of the thousands lost to disease and violence, of the concept of walking in beauty, which meant carrying sorrow without being crippled by it. This was the resilient psychology the studies would later identify, not the absence of pain, but the integration of it. Weeks turned into a month. Eli began to understand the third revelation. This hidden village was a node in a network. Runners came with news from the reservation, from other hidden bands. They were not isolated. They were the keepers of a continuum. They practiced the old ceremonies, but they also traded for modern tools. They were, in essence, conducting a long-term experiment in cultural endurance. And they had a problem. A sickness was moving through the children. Not a white man's fever, but a coughing illness that weakened them. Their medicinal herbs were less effective than usual. Datest looked at Eli, not with hope, but with a grim calculation. "You came from the outside. You know the medicines of the towns. Can you get them?" This was the pivot. The test shifted from passive learning to active risk. To leave the sanctuary was to risk everything for him and for them if he was followed back. But the empty place inside him now had a new shape. It was filled with the sound of children's coughs, with the worried eyes of mothers he had come to know. He had failed to save his own. Could he save theirs? He agreed. A plan was formed. He would travel to a distant mining town, Silver Peak, using a cover story as a down-on-his-luck prospector. He would buy quinine syrup, any medicines he could. KOs would go with him, disguised as his mute son, their eyes and ears for the return journey. The journey out was a descent into a world that now felt alien. Silver Peak was a roar of greed and desperation. After the respectful quiet of the mesa, the shouting, the filth, the smell of rot and whiskey assaulted him. He felt exposed, his every instinct screaming. He purchased the medicines from a skeptical storekeeper, stuffing vials into his inner coat. But as they turned to leave, Eli saw the notice. A faded wanted poster not for him, but nailed to the post. It offered a reward for information leading to the capture of hostile Apache bands suspected of hiding in the Dragoon Range. The description of a leader, an old one called Yawner, was clearly Goyathle, and at the bottom, a addendum in fresh ink, increased reward, believed to be guarding a hidden silver ledge. The legend had mutated into a magnet for greed. He hurried KOs out of town, a cold dread settling in his stomach. They were 2 days into their return to the mountains, sticking to the high game trails when KOs froze. The boy pointed, his sharp eyes seeing what Eli did not. Below them, in the very pass that led to the hidden canyon entrance, a column of dust. Not a natural dust devil, the organized, grinding dust of a group of riders. 6, maybe 7 men. And at their head, Eli recognized the hulking shape of one of the bandits who had burned his ranch. They were not chasing him. They were following a different scent, the scent of Apache silver, and they were, by terrible chance or twisted fate, heading directly toward the secret crack in the Turtle Rock. Eli's mind raced. The bandits were minutes from the entrance. A direct warning shot would only seal their path and get him and the boy killed. But there was another way, a path not on the map, a story KOs had shared during their long trek. He grabbed the boy's shoulder. "The waterfall canyon, the one with the echo. Can we get above them there?" KO's eyes widened, then narrowed in understanding. He nodded sharply. It meant abandoning the direct trail, scaling a treacherous rock face, a gamble with every second. They moved like ghosts, KOs leading with a preternatural sense of the land. Eli's lungs burned, his boots slipping on loose scree. Below they could hear the coarse laughter of the bandits, the jingle of tack horrifyingly close. They reached the rim of a narrow slot canyon. At its head, a seasonal waterfall was now a mere trickle, but the cliff face was a sheer drop. KOs pointed to an ancient, gnarled pine growing sideways from the rock. Without a word, he began shimmying down its trunk, using it as a living ladder. Eli followed, his heart in his throat. One slip would mean a broken neck and a beacon of noise. They hit the canyon floor running. The bandits' noise was just ahead, around a bend. Eli saw it then, the echo KOs mentioned. The canyon walls pinched tight here, creating a natural amplifier. He put a hand on KO's chest, stopping him. He didn't have a gun, but he had his voice and he had a desperate plan. He cupped his hands around his mouth and in the loudest, most commanding cavalry sergeant's bark he could muster, shouted into the canyon's throat. "Corporal, hold position. Scout reports hostiles in the pass. Deploy to the north ridge. Wait for my signal." Effect was instantaneous. The canyon magnified his voice, threw it back and forth, making one man sound like 20. The bandits' conversation died. Eli heard the distinct sound of horses shuffling nervously, men cursing in low, urgent tones. "You heard that? Armies crawling all over the north side," one voice hissed. "Forget the rock, Jake, they'll have us in irons," another pleaded. The leader, Jake, the one Eli recognized, growled back. "That's a trick, sounds off." But the seed of doubt was sown. Eli nodded to KOs. The boy let out a perfect, piercing mimic of a red-tailed hawk's cry, a known Apache signal. To the spooked bandits, it sounded like a scout's call. The decision was made for them. With a string of curses, they wheeled their horses and retreated back down the pass, riding hard away from the imagined army. Eli slumped against the cool rock, trembling with adrenaline. They had bought time, not victory. Jake was suspicious. He would regroup, maybe scout more carefully. The village's secret was now under active threat. They had to get back and warn everyone. Eli and Chaos ran the final stretch to the hidden crack, giving the prearranged signal, 3 spaced owl hoots. The guard let them through, his expression turning to alarm as Eli gasped out the news. The council assembled in minutes. The atmosphere was not panic but grim calculation. Dotest listened, then dropped the 4th chilling revelation. These are not just bandits, they are the fingers of a larger hand. A man named Harlan Stanner owns the Silver Peak mining concern. He has bought the politicians, the newspaper. The increased reward for Apache silver came from his office. He uses men like Jake to do what the army legally cannot: clear the land. He does not want a mine. He wants the watershed, all of it. Our springs feed the valley he needs for his stamp mills. The conflict was no longer about survival against nature or even against rogue criminals. It was a collision of 2 worlds, one built on relational ecology, the other on extractive capitalism. The hidden village sat on an aquifer, a geological treasure far more valuable than any silver ledge. Stanner wanted to erase them not for being Apache, but for being in the way. A plan formed, not of battle, but of misdirection and deep cunning. They would use the bandits' own greed against them. They had a day, maybe 2, before Jake returned, likely with more men. The elders decided to stage a discovery. A few men would create a false silver vein in a distant, useless canyon, salting it with genuine silver dust traded years before. They would let Jake's scouts find it, let them believe they had won. Meanwhile, the real village would prepare to vanish deeper into the mountain labyrinth, a move they called going into the stone's shadow. Eli was given a critical role. His face was known to Jake. He would be the believable decoy. He would be captured tending the false silver vein, playing a desperate prospector who stumbled upon Apache secrets. He would feed them a story of a main camp in the opposite direction, buying weeks for the real evacuation. It was incredibly dangerous. If Jake recognized him as the rancher he'd robbed, he was dead. If the performance faltered, he was dead. The night before the operation, Dotest came to him. She carried a small clay pot of paint. "You must look like you belong to the story," she said. She painted a simple symbol on his forehead, the same symbol that was on the original pouch, the winding path. "This is not disguise, this is a truth. You walk the path between worlds now. That is your strength and your danger." It was an acknowledgement that shattered his last notion of himself as an outsider. He was now a participant, an asset, a risk. The next morning it began. Eli, dressed in deliberately torn and prospected clothes, worked at the false site with 2 Apache men who slipped away moments before Jake's new, larger party arrived. The capture was brutal, convincing. Jake backhanded him, demanding to know what he was doing. Eli, spinning his tale of tracking stealthy engines to their silver cache, saw the moment of recognition flicker in Jake's eyes. It wasn't about the ranch, it was about the defiance. "You're that stubborn fool from the spread we burned," Jake sneered. "Shoulda died with your kin. Now you're a silver thief to boot." The personal venom made the charade more believable. They tied Eli up, made him guide them to the main camp he described. He led them on a grueling, days-long wild goose chase into a maze of canyons that held nothing but rattlesnakes and despair. He endured kicks, threats, and dwindling rations. But with each passing hour, he knew the village was melting deeper into the mountains. The sick children carried on litters, their entire world packed onto travois. On the 3rd day, as Jake's frustration reached a violent peak, the 5th revelation struck, changing everything. One of Jake's men, a younger, weaselly figure named Lem, pulled a rotting wanted poster from his saddlebag. It wasn't for Apache. It was for Elias McCullough, wanted for questioning in the murder of Harlan Stanner's foreman in Silver Peak. The date was from a month before Eli even reached the village. The foreman had been killed in a bar fight. Eli had been in the town that day buying supplies. He was a perfect patsy. Stanner hadn't just wanted the land. He needed a scapegoat for a crime to consolidate his local power. Eli wasn't just a decoy. He was the package deal, a man who could be blamed for murder and then justly killed resisting arrest over stolen silver. His death would close 2 of Stanner's problems neatly. The plan had layers Eli never imagined. He wasn't leading them away from the village. He was leading himself to an execution. As this sunk in, a new sound echoed through the canyon, not the fake army, but the very real, rhythmic tramp of mounted infantry. A U.S. Army patrol, likely tipped off by Stanner himself to clean up the aftermath, appeared at the canyon's mouth. Jake's men swore, trapped between the rock and the law. In the confusion, Eli saw his one chance. He slammed his head back into the nose of the man holding him, broke free of the loosened bonds, and ran not towards the army but straight up the nearest sheer rock wall, a desperate climb towards a ledge he'd spotted earlier. Shots rang out. Bullets sparked off stone around him. He hauled himself over the ledge as the canyon erupted into chaos below, bandits and soldiers shouting, more gunfire. He was wounded, a burning graze along his ribs, but free. He was also alone, hunted by both sides, with the army now between him and the only people left on Earth who knew the whole truth. The path had led him to the edge of a precipice, and the only way forward was to leap into a darkness deeper than any canyon. Bleeding and exposed on the high ledge, Eli had one advantage. He saw the whole board. The army detachment was small, a lieutenant and 6 green troopers, more interested in rounding up the well-known bandits than chasing a phantom prospector. They had Jake and his men in custody down in the canyon floor, arguing over jurisdiction and reward money. Stanner's plan was unraveling because his tools were too blunt. The lieutenant didn't want a complex conspiracy. He wanted a tidy report: bandits captured, area secured. Eli's wound was superficial, but his situation was not. He was a wanted man in the eyes of Silver Peak, and a loose end to Stanner. To go back was to walk into a cell and then a noose. To go forward meant finding a village that had likely vanished deeper into the stone. He made his choice not with the heart of a rancher or even a decoy, but with the mind of a student of Datest. He would use the truth as a weapon, but he would aim it carefully. Under cover of night, he descended. He didn't approach the army camp. He went to the bandits, tied to a supply wagon under a single sleepy guard. He found Lem, the weaselly one who'd shown him the wanted poster. In a whisper, Eli laid out the real calculus. Stanner set you up. You get the silver, he gets the land, and I hang for his murder. But who do you think takes the fall if the silver's a fake and the murder looks like a frame? The convenient outlaw's holding the bag. Jake's too stupid to see it. Are you? He placed a piece of flint from the false vein in Lem's bound hands. Proof it's worthless. You give this to the lieutenant. You tell him Stanner's whole scheme. You become the witness, not the outlaw. It was a long shot, appealing to a rat's survival instinct. Lem's eyes darted in the firelight, but his fingers closed around the rock. Eli slipped away into the darkness. He couldn't go to the village's old location. Instead, he went to the last place of pure instruction, the Turtle Rock. He sat at its base, the empty pouch in his hands, waiting for a sign he didn't believe would come. As dawn broke, he heard not an owl but the soft snort of a horse. His horse, the one he'd left weeks ago, stood picketed nearby, groomed and healthy. Beside it was K.O.'s. The boy smiled. You took the long path, he said. We watched you lead the bluecoats in circles. Dades said you would come here when you were finished. The village hadn't just hidden. They had kept a protective watch on him the entire time. The final, humbling revelation: he was never the lone hero. He was a thread being woven back into a fabric. They traveled for 2 days to the new location, a cavern system known only in the oldest stories, a place called the Mother's Ribs. There the entire community was reassembling, the children's coughs easing with the medicine Eli had procured. Datest listened to his account of his actions with the bandits. She nodded. You turned the snake's head to bite its own tail. This is good. But she knew, and he knew, that Stanner remained. A man with money and political power was a patient enemy. The land itself was still in danger. The solution came from an unexpected fusion. Eli, with his knowledge of property law and white settlement patterns, and the Apache elders with their immutable understanding of the land's natural boundaries, devised a new kind of map. They would not fight Stanner for the land. They would make the land legally untouchable. Using the precise locations of the hidden springs, the endangered medicinal plant groves, and the ancient trade paths, they drafted a document. It was not a deed. It was a trust of sanctuary, a concept Eli pitched to a sympathetic, disillusioned cavalry lawyer he'd known in his past life. The lawyer, intrigued by the ecological and historical argument, helped file it with the territorial surveyor's office. It created a cloud on the title, a contested claim based on prior use and natural resource conservation that would tie Stanner's ambitions in court for years, a battle his investors wouldn't have the stomach for. The personal payoff was quieter, deeper. Eli did not become a chief, nor did he marry into the tribe in some storybook ending. He found his place in the daily rhythm Dotist had always offered. He used his ranch skills to improve their horse breeding, creating a strain suited to the high country. He learned the language not fluently, but enough to listen to the stories by the fire. The empty place inside him was not filled, it was transformed. It became a space held by the community, an acknowledged loss that gave his wisdom its weight. He was called Brother Who Returned, a title denoting neither blood nor adoption, but earned belonging. The bandit Jake, facing prison, tried to bargain with Stanner's name. Lem, turning state's evidence with his flint proof, corroborated the story. A territorial investigation was launched, not out of justice for the Apache, but out of political embarrassment. Stanner's influence waned. The wanted poster for Eli was quietly forgotten, a bad piece of business everyone wanted to bury. The army, its mission technically accomplished with the bandits' capture, saw no gain in pursuing whispers of a hidden village that, according to their scouts, didn't exist. Years later, a government ethnographer traveling through the territory met an older white man living with an Apache band. He recorded the man's story as a curious folktale of cross-cultural friendship. He wrote, "The subject, one Eli McCullough, appears to serve as a kind of cultural liaison, demonstrating a hybrid lifestyle that, while anomalous, suggests a model of adaptation contrary to the narrative of inevitable conflict." He missed the point entirely. Eli wasn't a liaison. He was home. The map in the pouch had led him to a truth he now lived every day. That resilience is not a solitary bounce, but a network of support. That healing is not the absence of scars, but the presence of a community that honors them. One autumn evening, Eli sat with Dotist, now very old, watching the sunset paint the mesa. She pointed to the worn pouch which he still kept. "My brother saw the storm in you," she said, "the storm of grief that makes men blind. He also saw the good earth beneath, waiting for the right rain. The pouch was not a mystery. It was an invitation to a different kind of rain." The final, surprising detail was this: Goyathle had made more than one pouch. The elders, foreseeing the cultural storm that would sweep over their people, had identified other individuals, white and Mexican, who showed a capacity to see beyond fear. A few other pouches had been given out over the years. Some were never opened. Some were dismissed as superstition. Eli was one of the few that had been opened at the right moment, by a man ready to learn rather than to conquer. The plan had never been to save one cowboy. It had been to plant seeds of understanding in the blasted earth of the frontier. Hopping a few would take root. Eli was a living seed. He lived out his days in the mother's ribs, his hair growing white, his face losing its haggard tension. He never forgot Clara, Jack, or Sarah. He spoke of them often, and the community spoke their names with him, weaving them into its memory. He died an old man, not on a lonely ranch, but in a sunlit alcove surrounded by generations of children who called him grandfather. He was buried according to his wishes, in a way that honored both his birth and his chosen world. Wrapped in a quilt Clara had made, facing east towards the dawn within the circle of the village. His story, like the hidden springs, did not end. It seeped into the land, becoming part of the quiet, enduring wisdom that outlasts empires and silver rushes. The path from ashes had led, not to a new beginning, but to a continuous, resilient becoming. The story of Eli McCullough and the leather pouch is more than a frontier legend. It is a case study in a profound human truth that modern psychology is only beginning to quantify. That resilience is not an individual trait, but a network. Recall the research that found 65% of people exhibited no trauma symptoms after the September 11th attacks. They weren't superhuman. They were embedded in families, in communities, in systems of meaning that could hold their grief. Eli's initial solitude was his greatest vulnerability. The Apache, through Goyethlay's foresight, offered him a network. This narrative challenges the dominant myth of the self-made frontiersman. The real story of survival on the frontier was often one of disastrous isolation, of families wiped out by disease because they lacked communal knowledge. The Apache, conversely, survived centuries of onslaught not merely through warfare, but through an immense, carefully curated body of ecological and social wisdom. They understood that to save a people, you sometimes had to save a person from another people entirely, to build a bridge where everyone else saw a wall. The pouches were a brilliant strategy. They were targeted interventions. In a world of rigid conflict, they created possibilities for anomalous human connection. They acknowledged that healing and guidance could cross cultural boundaries, that a mentor did not have to look like you to save you. This reframes our understanding of historical contact. For every story of violent conflict, there are countless, quieter stories of trade, healing, shared survival, and mutual adaptation that were systematically erased from the official record. So what does this mean for us now, far removed from the Dragoon Mountains? The sealed pouch is a metaphor for the unexpected lifeline. It represents that piece of wisdom, that offer of help, that map to a new way of thinking that arrives exactly when our old world has burned down. It asks us, are we open to it? Or are we so wedded to our isolated fortresses of self-reliance that we would let the pouch gather dust on the shelf? It also asks us, who around us is sitting on ashes, and do we possess knowledge, a community, a perspective that we might offer as a map? Eli's journey teaches that redemption is not about going back or even finding a replacement. It is about transformation through integration. He didn't become Apache. He became a synthesis, a living proof that different ways of being could coexist and create something stronger. His legacy was not a bloodline, but a story passed down through Apache oral tradition and later, through curious ethnographers. A story that proved belonging is a choice validated by action. The final truth is this: the most valuable treasures are not hidden in the ground. They are hidden in plain sight, in the wisdom of elders, in the resilience of communities, in the courage to accept help from an unexpected quarter. The real map never leads to gold. It leads back to connection. And that is a destination always worth the journey. If this story of hidden paths and second chances resonated with you, consider subscribing for more documentaries that explore the forgotten bridges of history. Tell us in the comments, what would your sealed pouch contain? What wisdom would you hope to find when all seems lost? Thank you for listening.